Our next speaker is Bo Li. Bo is an assistant professor in the computer science department at the UIUC. She got her PhD from Vanderbilt in 2016. Her research focuses on machine learning, security, privacy, and game theory. She's particularly interested in exploring vulnerabilities of machine learning systems to various adversarial attacks and developing robust approaches for a learning system. Please welcome Bo.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to share my research about adversarial machine learning here with you all. So, first of all, we know that deep learning, machine learning, AI has been ubiquitous in the world in every domain, including autonomous driving, healthcare, and smart city. However, in my research, I mainly focus on even such very powerful machine learning and AI technologies has brought us a lot of security and privacy concerns. For example, in 2016, in real-world example, that the Associated Press Twitter account has spreading a rumor saying that the White House has been attacked, which has swiped about $136 billion within seconds because of the autonomous trading bots just dump a large amount of stocks within seconds based on the fake news. And similarly, in the hospital data sets, like in one of our previous work, we find out that even with just the discharge workflow segmentations, we can identify a lot of privacy medical treatments about each patient. So this is just saying that within this big data area, we can actually have a lot of security and privacy concerns, even though they have brought us a lot of convenience. So that concludes us that even currently with a lot of convenient platforms, for example, PyTorch TensorFlow, as the previous speaker mentioned, and we are still living in an adversarial environment. That's why typically machine learners still have a very hard life to make our machine learning platform robust. And that's why here we want to get together and understand what's the adversary model and why the machine learning models are so vulnerable currently, and therefore we can find certain solutions, hopefully, to improve the robustness of our current machine learning platforms. And this is just showing that this is an important problem, and both government and different funding agencies recognize that adversarial machine learning as an important topic in current scenarios. So after this background, I think the first question people may ask is about what exactly adversarial machine learning and why such vulnerability happens. So there has been a lot of phenomena described by, for example, Professor Mendry's research from the image perspective. And fundamentally, I would say there is one question or problem that causes adversarial behaviors, which is that in traditional machine learning techniques, and people always assume or implicitly assume that training and testing data from the similar, even the same distribution. And that's why we can always make the training on one and make inference on the other, even they are unseen. However, in the considering adversarial behaviors, either the training or the testing data distribution can be manipulated in certain way. So, for example, when the training data distribution was manipulated, it is called poisoning attack or the backdoor attacks mentioned by the first speaker. And when the testing data distribution is manipulated, it's called evasion attacks, where when the model is trained, and then you can still generate so-called adversarial attacks or adversarial examples to fool the existing well-trained machine learning models. So in this talk, I will mainly focus on evasion attacks, since a lot of times we can protect our model and do not release it. So evasion seems kind of very severe problems. And I will give some examples of physical attacks against the different types of real-world sensors, and then hopefully give two potential defense principles from both game theoretical and properties of machine learning models. So first, let's look at the physical examples of adversarial attacks. So even given a typical learning algorithm, for example, deep neural network, a simple example is that we can have a loss function, and based on the training data X and Y pairs, given the example of supervised learning, we can minimize this loss function. and use, for example, SGD very efficiently and find some very good local optimal. However, given an adversary behavior, what they can do is that they can add a very small perturbation on top of a given example, for example, x, and then the goal is to maximize the loss function here, which is opposite with the learner's objective. So in this way, we can see that by adding a small magnitude of perturbation, it's possible to generate such adversarial behaviors against the existing trained machine learning models. And here the perturbation epsilon here is actually relatively easy to find. For example, we can use local search, combinatorial optimization, and also use certain convex relaxation to find the optimal or minimized perturbation magnitude. And this is also in digital domain also from Professor Mandry's examples. And then the people always ask a question. So how such adversarial examples are like realistic in real world? Take an example of autonomous driving. So how realistic the adversarial examples could be, for example, in terms of attacking existing autonomous driving systems, which is one of the biggest use case for machine learning and AI technologies. So here we know that in autonomous driving, we have a lot of different sensors for a car. For example, perception and LiDAR and radar, all kinds of sensor fusion together. However, in real world, we can give an example of stop sign. This is a real stop sign taken near, one is Vancouver, one is Berkeley. And we can see there are always some random patterns on the sign. So people may question, like, what if those patterns are actually adversarial, but actually they do not cause any attention of humans, so you would not recognize that, would not replace the sign in reality. And there are several challenges if you want to do that, which is you want to generate a kind of so-called physical adversarial perturbation on a stop sign. So in real world, compared with the digital world, additional challenges raise up. For example, the first is different physical conditions. For example, different angles and distance and lightning conditions will make this low, as we mentioned, the low magnitude of perturbation vulnerable. So for example, if you have a, like the dog and the cat example, if you change the image a little bit with different angles and distances, they may fail to perform such attacks. So how to solve this question and generalize that so-called robust physical adversarial perturbation? That's one challenge in real world. And the other challenge is that, as we mentioned, the perturbation in reality, hopefully that is of low magnitude and imperceptible. But in real world, for example, considering an autonomous driving car driving by, actually you hope a camera can capture the perturbation itself in real world. So how can you make the perturbation visible and unnoticeable to human? That's another challenge. And also other challenges raise up, for example, in real world, you always have some fabrication error. So when you want to print out something like red, but it turns out the color printer will give you something like pink or orange. And also, when we generate perturbation given an image in the digital domain, we can generate perturbation everywhere, including the background. But here, if you want to have a physical perturbation, it has to be on certain objects. So this is another different challenges. So next, I will just quickly go through how we can leverage and solve these challenges with different techniques and make them coherent together and eventually generate a so-called physical perturbation against the real-world systems. So first is the challenge about the different physical conditions. For example, recall that the first loss function is what we used to generate adversarial perturbations in digital world. For example, the whole objective function we want is to minimize the delta, which is the magnitude of perturbation, plus the loss of the adversarial example, which is x plus delta is generated adversarial instance, and then hopefully that instance will go to the target, which is the y star here, which is different with the ground truth y. And considering different physical conditions here, what you can generate is, instead of the original loss function, like the digital loss function here, we can generate a large loss function by sampling a different transformations from real-world data distributions. For example, here is an example of different angles of a stop sign in real world. And you can draw a sample of the distribution and add to this big loss function. And in addition to this distribution of different angles, you can change the colors and the physical conditions of lightnings, etc. So make this loss function to consider as much conditions as possible and improve the generalization of this attack. So by doing this, we hopefully can improve the robustness of the generated adversarial perturbation. And second is about the spatial constraints. So as we mentioned, we hope this perturbation can be onto some object itself and still of some meaningful shape so that it will be less realizable by human, which is called from hidden in the human psyche. So basically what you can get is that you can add a mask to this perturbation region so that the generated perturbation will be only limited to certain spatial regions. And therefore, if the shape itself is a meaningful, like for example, it's some graffitis or some patterns, then you will not raise humans' attention too much. And this way, there are some tricks to find those vulnerable regions. So as we mentioned, there are some regions are correlated to robust features and some regions are less robust features. And the trick here is that, for example, you can use some sparse regularizers, for example, L1, to generate the sparse perturbations, and then find those vulnerable regions, and specifically to focus on those regions and use, for example, L2 or LTV loss to smooth out those regions and generate more realistic perturbations. And the last challenge is fabrication error. So basically, there is a more general loss here that you can use the NPS loss to minimize the distance between the printable vector P prime here and the desired vector P hat, so that by minimizing these two, you will be able to make sure the generated color or generated perturbation will be as close as possible with what you can get in real world. So by solving these several challenges together, we will see what we can get in a static experiment. So basically what you can see here, maybe someone has saw some of such stop signs in real world, is that each column shows a type of perturbation. And for example, for the first row, you can see that the first two rows, they are kind of subtle perturbation. As you can see, this perturbation looks like fading out. But actually, all the stop signs in these slides was misrecognized as a speed limit sign 45 by a real-world camera and under different conditions. And each row here shows different physical conditions. And on the later three columns, some of them show some random letters, and the later two columns show just white and black rectangles. So this is somewhat surprising that several, like four rectangles are enough to fool the stop sign in real world and make it targeted to be misrecognized as certain adversarial targets. So this is some examples of static tests. And there are some physical tests that we can see what it happens if a real car driving by towards such physical perturbed stop signs. So the left-hand side is a control experiment, adversarial stop sign. The right-hand side is a control experiment. And when you pay attention to the captions, you will see the result of the classification. So you can see on the left-hand side, it's consistently misrecognized as speed limit sign 45 for most of the time, even the car is driving with certain speed. And this is another example of different types of perturbation. However, on the right-hand side, as a control experiment, it's always been recognized as a stop sign. So this just shows that with a car driving in certain speed under different conditions in real world, this physical stop signs can always mislead the real machine learning models and the vision systems encrypted in a car. And actually this is for attacking classification models. And just now one audience asked about the object detections. And that's exactly one question we got before. So people ask, what if it is object detections? Because there is some automatic cropping mechanisms here with the automatic proposal generation approach. If whether this kind of physical perturbation effective or not. So this is an example that's attacking YOLO. So basically, you can see the physical stop sign here. Most of the time, actually all the time, it cannot be recognized as a stop sign, but other objects can be recognized without any problem. So this shows that under different physical conditions, the physical perturbation can effectively attack the object detectors as well, unless you go to very, very close to the sign. So they recognize the letters here because we on purpose do not block the letters. So when they recognize the letters, they can find it's a stop sign. However, the argument is that it will be too close. It will be too close for you to stop a car with this speed. And other questions may raise about the white box and black box attack, because in this one, it's a specific white box, and you get the gradient directly from the model, and you can optimize your perturbation. And actually, we can leverage the same perturbation, use a phenomenon called transferability that use the same perturbation on model A, you can test it on totally different model and perform the so-called black box attack. And what you can see here is that this is the same perturbation test on the 5-star CNN and in a very different physical environment. And you can see even like this, and this is a less complicated environment, the stop sign is always misrecognized until you get very close. So this stop sign raised a lot of interest and attentions, and actually this physical stop sign was displayed in the Museum of London currently, and people get quite excited about why the real-world attack examples can be generated and attack the real-world perception systems of a car. So after this physical attack examples, people ask the question about, okay, if the perception system is vulnerable, we know images are vulnerable, there are some overfitting information, so the models have over capacities, so they'll always have some room to generate such perturbation and attacks. So people think, for example, some autonomous driving startups, companies think that if we have sensor fusion, for example, if we equipped it with LiDAR together with perception sensors, this may be more robust. And here, I just want to quickly go through, we'll not go to the details because we also want to go to some examples of defense. And here, just one example, I want to show that actually LiDAR system itself in real world is not that robust either. For example, this is tested on Apollo open source LiDAR system from Baidu. And in reality, there are a lot of additional challenges in terms of attacking a real-world LiDAR system. For example, the real-world LiDAR system is not an end-to-end model. You cannot directly get a gradient as in the classification image model. And also, they have a lot of different components connected together, which will reduce the aggregated adversarial perturbation effects. However, even with such real-world constraints and challenges, and we are still able to achieve certain adversarial goals. So one goal is that what if we can generate a real-world object and put this object on the road so that even though it's an obviously large object, it still cannot be recognized by the LiDAR system. And the other goal is that what if we put an object onto the car or near the car so that your car in front of an autonomous driving car will not be recognized by that car behind you, which is obviously quite dangerous. And I want to actually again show some videos. And this is tested on real world like highways. And the experiment here set up is that on the top, there is adversarial objects showing there, and the left-hand side is the LiDAR detection system. So basically, you can see if it's optimized adversarial object put on the highway, when the autonomous driving car driving by, the LiDAR actually failed to detect this object itself. And if we put a box with regular size and with regular shape and the similar size with the adversarial object we generated, and you can see it clearly as a control experiment clearly detect this object. So here on the top, you can see this box is always almost misrecognized, even though there is clear the box here, which is like a 3D printed object, which is like relatively this large as a box. And if we put a box with similar size in the middle, we can see that most of the time, let's see. Most of the time, it will detect the adversarial objects with a green box. So another example. So on the top, you can see that most of the time, the green box show up, which means this real box here was detected. But if this, the object with a slightly weird shape here, this is 3D printed and optimized in a way to attack the LiDAR. And this LiDAR system always cannot find the green box here, which means it fails to detect the objects. So these two examples just want to show that in real world, actually, no matter its vision or the LiDAR perception systems, different physical adversarial attacks can happen in real world, even though the real world scenarios can be much more complicated compared with the digital environment. So the next, based on all these attacks, and I don't think I need to emphasize the severe consequences of the digital adversary examples, since there are like hundreds of work for it so far already. So next, I want to introduce two principles in terms of defense from both game theoretical perspective and based on the properties of machine learning models. So first, let's look at the game theoretical perspective. So far we know adversarial machine learning, as we mentioned, is quite important. And there are many work in terms of defense and detection has been proposed. However, one significant or important message is that those defense or detections are mostly broken by adaptive or more clever, intelligent, sophisticated attackers again. So this is a bad news. And this forms like certain cat and mouse game, like we have better attack and then again we have better defense, and then it can be attacked again. So how can we end this game? And here I want to introduce another game formulation, which is Dagobah game. But first, let's look at a simple example from the NLP example, because in the NLP domain, the features are more interpretable, for example, the words, compared with the pixels of the image. So I want to use this simple example to show how can we build a good game model to improve the robustness of our current learning platforms. So first, this is a very simple example of spam filter. And what you can see here is that if you have a spam and you can train, for example, a bag of words classifiers, and by assigning some weights to the words, and then what you can get is some scores, and by comparing with some threshold, you can find out this is a spam, for example. And this is what we call the spam filter version 1. Very simple. And then with the attacker comes in, what an attacker can do is add, for example, add some good words. So by adding these good words, even though the adversarial words are still here, but then you can lower the weight and compare with the static threshold, you will see it clearly be misrecognized ham. And this iteration can go on, so the spammer can put it back, so the defender can put it back into the model to retrain it, kind of like adversarial retraining, and you can improve the efficiency again. But this can go on and form, as we said, a repeated game. But how we can end this game? So I would propose, I will actually propose a new, leverage the new game, Dagobah game, to model the behavior of the attacker and defender in the learning perspective. For example, in the Dagobah game, typically there are two players. One is a leader, one is a follower. So basically the leader will commit some strategy and the follower will follow the strategy and make the final decision. So this is not a repeated game. This is a two-player and one-step game. And the good thing for this is that if for example, the leader here is formulated as a learner, so the learner can commit some strategy, which kind of, for example, the classifier here. And you can see the key point here is the oracle, which we have an adversary model. So as long as we can somewhat model the adversary behavior from us, for example, oracle, we can consider this attacker behaviors into this adversarial strategy so that the defender can always generate his robust learning strategies based on the attacker's consideration. And this shows that with this commit strategy, we have two goals. One is to minimize the attacker's attack success rate, and the other is even though we cannot defend 100% of the attack, we can always increase the cost of the attacker to attack the system, which is actually a very important principle in security to make the attack harder and harder. And there are several ways to model the attacker behaviors here. For example, we can model it from the mathematical perspective, or we can use human subject to understand the real-world attacker behavior. So in this work, I will mainly focus on the mathematical modeling here to show how we can leverage the attacker's behavior to improve the robustness of the learning process. So we can see here from the previous simple example, there are three important components. One is, for example, if we want to model the adversarial behavior, the adversarial goal is to minimize the cost function between the X, the original instance, and the XA, which is the adversarial generated instance, such that the generated instance will always be recognized as benign by comparing with certain threshold delta here. So we can see either the cost function is important because we need to consider the feature substitution, or the feature selection is important because, as we mentioned, we have robust and non-robust features, and the dynamic operational decision is important here because if we have a static optional threshold here, if the attacker knows it, we can always perform certain adaptive attack. So how to model this dynamic optional decision with a certain function to automatically learn it is actually another important research. So I will mainly focus on this part and give you some very interesting results to get a sense of how can we make our learning algorithms more dynamic in real world, so that by adding those dynamics, the attacker will not be able to, even they get the algorithm, the architecture itself, they will not always be able to get the whole framework and instead of attack it efficiently. For example, here, still with the original very simple like optimization function for the attacker, so instead of a static threshold delta here, we want to use a function like Q to learn this threshold delta dynamically. And one drawback you can see here is that this function can be, the input of this function can be of very high dimension because it takes the x prime, which is the generated input, and the predicted input as the input, the input of this function. But the dimension of this input can be of 1,000 by 1,000, as for example, image. So here, the nice thing is, or it's a very generic technique is you can use a finite set of basis function to reduce the dimension of this learned function so that you can always perform, like optimize a finite set of basis function and optimize the coefficient of for each of the basis function. So that based on this learning, dynamic learning threshold, you can actually prove it will be NP complete for attacker to attack the system. And eventually, you can optimize this whole optimization function as this process. For example, here, this is a traditional learning algorithm that you want to minimize the loss by optimizing the weights given the training data, for example, X and Y pairs. And here you add another loss term, which is you consider the adversarial behaviors. For example, for all the Y equals to 1, which is adversarial instance, you can generate a box here that to model what's the cost of the adversaries and what's the budget of the adversary to consider what they can do in the worst case scenario, and add these two loss together with the L1 loss to make the trade-off between the feature reduction and the robustness. And based on this optimization, you can see as long as we can solve it efficiently, you will be able to have a robust learning systems because you have considered both benign accuracy and the adversarial behavior. However, this is not convexity, and this is hard to solve. And but we can use the mixed integer linear program to directly formulate the original optimization into this linear program and use existing solver to solve it. But we don't need to go to detail about this, but we can see this is definitely solvable efficiently. And by solving this with existing solvers, we can see that the approach actually compared with different state-of-art adversarial behaviors, including adversarial training, this can achieve much better robustness. And this is based on the game of stackable game, which is essentially can formulate it as a min-max game. And however, people may ask, this may not be quite scalable in certain sense because we have to use these tricks like finite different basis functions to improve the efficiency. And can we directly leverage the properties of current machine learning models to improve the robustness? So I will introduce one work in 5 minutes. And I think this is actually quite interesting. And although it could be a very simple solution, but I will show that it could be very effective. Because, for example, we have discussed a lot about classification and object detections, but those actually have some information concentrated in the model itself. But for example, for segmentation itself, it has some properties for this algorithm itself. For example, for segmentation, like here, if you have an image, you can attack it to different targets. For example, you can have a Hello Kitty or like just pure colors to attack the segmentation model. But we know that for segmentation, which is different with classification, is that you always have some spatial consistency among different features or like the pixels. So if you generate some heat map for the cross entropy around the pixels from the surrounding pixel prediction for one pixel, you will see that if it's a benign, you can clearly see the edges of a street. But if it's adversarial, like when you have perturbation added into the images, you can see all the boundaries are very blurry. It's kind of just a mess up, which shows that when you add perturbation, even though it's not perceptible to human eye systems, actually it breaks the spatial consistency intrinsically. So such property cannot be removed easily by attacker. So if there is a way to identify such property, you will be able to improve the robustness of the models. At least you can detect such adversarial behaviors. So how to detect it? Actually very simple. So you can, as we mentioned, the spatial consistency was broken by the adversarial perturbation, right? So what you can do is, for example, leverage the spatial consistency by given an image, you can generate two crops with overlaps. And then you can throw these two overlapped crops into a segmentation model and get the segmentation out from this model. So you can see if it is a benign, the overlapped region will have very consistent results in terms of, for example, MRU, because if you are doing the segmentation task. And if it's adversary, because the spatial consistency is broken, so the behavior, the prediction are very different from this figure. And based on this, we even do not need to learn any function. We can directly generate a threshold because you can see this separation is very clear. It's not mixed up together. So these types of intrinsic properties are very hard to avoid by attackers. So by some quantitative results, you can see under different types of attack, DAG and Houdini are different types of attacks against the segmentation. And you can see the detection rate is almost 100%. And one nice thing is that if you consider the adaptive attacker, as I mentioned, even though the attacker knows you use this detection method to detect my adversarial examples, still the detection rate is almost 100%. The reason is that when you generate those random crops, it's very random. So for the attacker, what they need to do is to make sure every crop is consistent with our original, like the segmentation results. That's very hard because first, they do not know which patch was used by the defender. And second is if you generate a lot of patches, the perturbation will be added up and it will be very high. So that is a trade-off for attacker, so they cannot do that. So eventually, it shows that attacker fails. So by doing this, we can see with this specific learning properties, we can leverage it and improve the robustness and detect adversarial behaviors. Yeah. So based on this, I think I'm out of time, but I will say that actually those attack and defenses all our work has been reported by different medias, and actually it shows that different attacks in real world has raised a lot of attentions, and defense is very important. And so far we have, for example, leverage game theory, which is very effective but may not be so scalable. And we can leverage different properties of learning models to improve the robustness. However, we have to identify different specific properties for different models, which is another hard open question. Can we automatically identify what properties will be useful to improve the robustness of machine learning models? So that could be a very interesting direction to go for. Yeah. Thank you.
Going off that, comparing different machine learning models, you wanted to create robust models across the board. From your perspective, especially with physical attacks, looking at like object detection, image classification, or segmentation models, which are, I mean, maybe it's a stupid general question, but which are easier to attack and defend against? And like, if you were wanting to formalize a problem, which method would you choose?
Yeah, I would say attacks are always easy. Any model is easy, no matter real world or any model digital world. But defense is hard. But some defense you can leverage, for example, segmentation. Now we have solved it. I would think, oh, it's maybe much easier than classification, because classification has you have to actually leverage some semantic additional information to improve the robustness. But segmentation, only based on spatial consistency, we can achieve almost a 100% detection. That I would be very happy. And some, I don't show the example here. Some model, for example, videos, you can leverage the temporal consistency, and audios, you can use temporal consistency. We also achieve almost a 100% detection rate for audio and videos. So those, like you can imagine, have some specific properties would help to improve robustness. But some models are very generic. For example, classification, I would say it's a little bit harder. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Speaking of physical attack on LiDAR system, do you think techniques like spoofing can be used to generate adversarial patterns instead of putting a physical object on the road? Do you think such attacks would be realistic?
Yeah, for LiDAR system, you have to have an object, right? If you want to generate some object onto the spoofing onto the car or certain things, it will be possible. But for LiDAR, we always need an object so that the reflection can be captured by the LiDAR systems. Yeah. Any questions? Okay. Yeah. Thank you.